Welcome to Radio Worldview. I'm August Huckabee. This is Mark Bertrand joining us today as a guest here in Canyon City, Colorado at Worldview Crux. So, Mark, tell us kind of what you're doing this week and what's your role?
So every semester at Crux, I come out for a week and I get to teach literature, basically. So in the fall, I come out and I teach Flannery O'Connor's story, Parker's Back, which I use as a sort of vehicle into the whole question of how artists use symbolism and signs in their work in order to get at sort of deeper things. Then in the spring, I get to come back and spend a week talking through Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor chapter inside Brothers Karamazov. And so there's continuity because both of those pieces are kind of creative, artistic ways of using the image of Christ or the story of Jesus to get at some philosophical ideas, but Dostoevsky does it in a really different way. And so that's kind of my 1-2 punch, and I just love doing it.
Yeah. Well, we appreciate you getting in the car and coming down here and making time. So you've been a really great supporter of the Crux through the years. So I appreciate the biannual visits we get to. Yeah. Well, today we are going to be talking about integrating worldview into your church because you're a pastor back in
Sioux Falls, South Dakota, yeah.
And so I wanted to talk to you about this because I follow you on Instagram, and so I see that you do something called Worldview Wednesdays at your church. You're obviously a longtime Worldview Academy faculty member. And so I just wanted to talk about that because I don't really know many that cross that boundary, right? In terms of saying like you are a pastor that's trying to integrate worldview into your church. And I think one thing we get a lot from students over the summer or even parents over the summer is asking, how do I bring this into my church? And I think we don't have a lot of resources for step-by-step how to do that. So seeing that you've been doing that, I think it's helpful to talk through. So I know we talked about first, as far as flow, we talked about Christianity and culture conferences a little bit. So can you give me a rundown on that? Have you done that at your church? What's that?
Yeah, so Christianity and culture conferences are something that Worldview Academy has been doing for years. And these are conferences where churches partner with Worldview Academy to do basically a weekend conference that's centered on worldview. So the churches who host these events are usually pastored by leaders who are trying to figure out how to kickstart a discipleship in impacts in their church where they want to focus on life of the mind, Christian worldview, maybe going deeper into some of the big questions. And so hosting a conference like this is a way to really plunge people into the deep end and start this new emphasis. Because, I mean, as you know, a lot of churches and a lot of pastors see in the 21st century that we have a bit of a discipleship crisis, right? Where churches may be large in size, but in terms of the formation of their members, it's thinner than ever, right? You think about the things that in past generations, you sort of grew up in church learning all this stuff. But if you talk to people today, young people, they often don't have the level of knowledge. They don't have all the information about the scriptures that their parents or their grandparents did because the experience has shifted, right? So a lot of pastors see that and are thinking, okay, how do we move over and start doing discipleship more intentionally? And so this is a way of doing that. Worldview Academy comes in and works with you to basically like light that fire in your congregation.
Yeah. And what I see or have seen from Christianity and culture conferences in the past too is it's a great way to try to knock down the sacred secular divide, right? One of the foundational things that Worldview kind of brings in is this idea of saying there is no divide between secular and spiritual. Like everything is spiritual. And so if that's your job, if that's your school, if that's your sports team, it's not just church on Wednesdays and or Sundays and then all these other things, but it's all integrated together. And wherever you are is your mission field. And so I think Christianity and culture conferences are really powerful because they bring in someone from the outside to kind of, blow in, blow up, and blow out on this new idea. And then the pastor has the opportunity to kind of follow up on that conversation and on the things that it starts.
Yeah, no, that's right. And there are opportunities not just to follow up, but to really like be part of the experience. So, for example, just a few weeks ago, I was speaking at one of these Christianity and culture conferences in California, where two churches had actually partnered together to put on this conference. And in addition to having me and Andrew Morton come from Worldview Academy and speak, they had also designed like breakout sessions, after hours, debriefs, that sort of thing, where the pastors of the churches and their leaders were able to guide people through these questions that we had unpacked. And so it was not like just having somebody from the outside come and speak. It was us working together, the guys from the outside and the guys from the inside, in order to make this a real catalyst experience. And that worked really well. Like I was really impressed by it. And so I know, because I'm a pastor, I know that it can be difficult when you are thinking in terms of the church schedule and the stuff you've got going on. I think a lot of times it feels like reaching to the outside, organizing something like this is going to be a heavy lift. But the benefits of doing this sort of thing are incredible, and it will surprise you how that light switches on in the minds of your members. Not just young people, but people of every ages come to these conferences, and it's incredible. Just the pages of notes. You see people just furiously writing things down and thinking through the ideas. And I mean, in the 21st century in the church, I think we're often guilty of underestimating people's ability to engage with those profound ideas. So this, I know, a lot of pastors find this not only encouraging, but also eye-opening to see, these people that maybe I thought were not interested in these things actually are. And now we're having just a much deeper conversation just as a result of that one experience.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that Worldview speakers do so well, is because they're so trained to engage middle school and high school students that part of the DNA is to be really engaging and really application-based in the way that they're speaking. And so whenever we bring that into Christianity and culture conferences, we see that not only do students, but also adults really resonate with that because there's a high application piece to it.
This is the irony, that oftentimes people look at what we're doing and think, okay, that's for young people. What they don't understand is that the way we speak to young people is different, right? We don't dumb it down. We don't have this idea.
Youth group gain.
No.
Yeah, it's not stuff like that.
We don't go into this with the idea that we need to sort of bring the good things down to their level.
Right. Or beg them to listen to us.
Exactly. Because you have to remember, in their educational experience, that's not the way teachers speak to them, right? They are challenged. They are expected to rise to the occasion. They are spoken to as if they're intelligent and capable of thinking deep things. Oftentimes it's only in the church where they're spoken to in that way that presupposes that they don't have these questions or that they can't think them through. And so I would say adults who sit in on Worldview Academy lectures find it's not quote unquote for kids. They find it challenging because they're used to being accommodated and not challenged, right? And so, one anecdote, when I wrote my book, Rethinking Worldview, of course, it's based on my experience teaching predominantly high school students at Worldview Academy. And I heard from an adult who had read the book and said, it's pretty difficult going, like it's pretty densely packed. And I struggled with some of it. And I said, well, I understand. I mean, it wasn't written for you. It was written for high school students, but let's be honest, for a lot of us, those years in school are the time that we will be the most challenged in our lives. And after it's over, it's like we don't use those muscles anymore.
Right.
Right. But in the life of discipleship, we want to think deeply. And a lot of people are just longing or yearning to be able to have these conversations and, are frustrated that they can't. Like they're looking for a place where they could really explore these things. And so I think when pastors and church leaders realize that their people long for this and that the church could be the place where those conversations happen. I mean, it should be the place, right? It's an epiphany. And so I think, as self-serving as it might seem, the advice I want to give to pastors is always, look, first step, just open your mind to the idea of hosting one of these conferences. If that seems overambitious, partner. Reach out to another church, maybe a school, something like that, where you don't feel like you've got to do all of the organizing and promotion, but don't let those barriers get in the way of doing it, because you're going to find on the other side of it that you're working with like a different congregation, that people are switched on
Right.
in the way that you've always wanted them to be.
Right. Yeah, it's a good chance to like light the fire. Exactly. Create that. I think that's one thing that we see students take away every year is just this perspective of saying, I didn't know there were other people out there like me, and I didn't know that my faith was so relevant in today's world. And so just think, if you could bring that perspective into a church where you say, oh, there are others who are interested in these things, then you're creating friendships, you're creating connections, and that just creates ripple effects as well.
Yeah. A lot of people in the modern church feel like, we are alone in the room together. Like we've gathered together for worship, but everyone is telling themselves, no one here understands the questions I'm wrestling with. And yet, the reality is everyone's wrestling with us. And so we're just not talking about it. So this is a way to start talking about it with people who've been talking about it their whole lives.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great, I think, jumping off point. And so then what do you do from that point forward, right? So we talked about a couple things. One thing is that you do some podcasts, and tell me about those, because you have a couple.
Yeah.
I'll tell you about the ones we do as well.
So, I've always been interested in podcasting just as a medium because of all of the ways that you can do outreach. For me, podcasting is the one where there's a minimal effort, maximum reach kind of proposition, right? And because in order to do it well, there's a bar, but it's not that high.
Right. It's
so,
very achievable.
Exactly. I think pretty much any church these days has the tools already to do a podcast. All you've got to do is think through the how, right? So at a certain point, I realized that we just needed a way to connect during the week. And I'd noticed things like let's say I wanted to get together with people from my church, once a week and talk through, different aspects of the life of the church or things in the culture, whatever. Just scheduling that, that people could show up was difficult. Whereas with a podcast, they consume it when they can, right? And so a lot of reasons for doing it. You create this content that lives forever online. And so people who are new to your congregation oftentimes will go sort of catch up and go through.
They're figuring out where to go to church. They'll go look up what you have on.
Yeah. That's very common now. Yeah. So for us at Grace in Sioux Falls, the strategy that we came up with was basically twofold. So we have 2 podcasts that we do consistently. We have some other things that we do more intermittently. But the 2 sort of consistent ones. One was focused on just a general audience, and that's called The Commentary. And my co-host Cameron Brooks and I will talk about, we say basically vision, worship, and life at our church. And so typically these might be topics we might be discussing. What's going on at church? We might be discussing things we're just interested in thinking about that are in the zeitgeist, but it'll typically have sort of a nexus around, Christian discipleship and our own experience of it locally. And then I do a second podcast called The Big Question, which is aimed at young disciples, so kids in the church. And so there's no sort of age cap, but what it tends to be is, I would say, the bulk of the kids who are asking the questions will be like 10 and under, right? So they are really curious. They have a lot of questions about what they're learning about the Bible, and they can basically come at you from every different direction. And so what we do is, in our services, we have basically a tool that kids in church get to interact with during the service that focuses them on like answering questions about like the sermon and things like that. So they're more engaged with what's going on. And one of the things that they get to do is ask the pastor a question, like anything you want to ask. There's no limits. And then I take those questions and I kind of sort them, right? I have serious questions, I have fun questions, and then I always single out one big question in each episode. And we release these on a weekly schedule that corresponds to our Sunday school season. So if we're having Sunday school that Sunday, there's going to be a new episode.
Sure.
And over the years that we've been doing it, we're just at episode 180.
Okay.
And the questions, as you can imagine, are like all over the place. The kids want to know, questions about, like, why does God do things the way he does them? They'll often have, questions about like puzzling things they've read in the Bible or stories they've heard, but they also just have wacky questions too, that are just out of left field. And the purpose is not so much to give them answers to their questions. It's to show them the process of thinking about these things and what we can answer and what we can't, right? So I emphasize the idea that, there's a difference between what the Bible says and our speculation, right? And so that's a theme we're always sort of distinguishing, right? Like, here's what we can say for certain from the scriptures. Here's our theories that are interpretation, and here's why we think they're right, but they're not the same thing as what's clearly taught. And then, of course, behind it all is encouraging young people to feel like it's okay to ask questions. A lot of people have this experience in church where they are reluctant to voice the questions they have because they are afraid it'll look like they don't have faith. They're not one of the good people because they have these doubts or uncertainties or whatever. They certainly don't want to say, oh, to me, it looks like the Bible is contradicting itself here, or this looks like it's wrong. Well, how do you answer that? They don't want to, say those things. And so what we're trying to do is encourage young people to think it's okay to say all that stuff out loud, because by asking, now I have the opportunity to answer. Whereas if they hold those questions in and never ask them, I never even know that that's what they're wondering.
Yeah, you can't address something that's not supposed.
Exactly. So those are the two flagships, and there's another one called Hearing the Music that we've done intermittently. One of the members of our church and a good friend of mine is Delta David Geyer. He's the artistic director, the conductor of the South Dakota Symphony Orchestra, and a very devout and open Christian in his approach to his work. And so on Hearing the Music, we have taken pieces of music and then broken them down, and he will explore the artistic side of things, and I'll try to bring some insight into the theological side. We're looking at sacred music and unpacking that stuff. And interestingly, with that one, it's actually been broadcast on public radio. So I never expected that a podcast that we created would end up on public radio, but just because, the artistic content, they were interested in it. And as a result, we literally got to talk about Christian theology on public radio. And so that was an unexpected opportunity to do that. And we do other things as well. So our community groups are exploring the connection between the way we worship and like discipleship, like the idea that a worship service is a blueprint for the life of discipleship. So if you go to our website, there's a whole series of discussions where we take each element and show how it models.
Each element of the church service?
Exactly. So from, the very beginning, the call to worship to, confession of sin, the reading of the scriptures, the preaching, the various prayers, communion, all of those things have a analogy or sort of an application in everyday life. And so I say, like, if you're wondering how to live the Christian life, you literally just have to take that worship service, and that's your blueprint. You just do those things every day and living the Christian life. So we wanted to unpack that. And so we recorded the conversations, and now anyone who, has questions about it, we can point them there and say, hey, go here. So basically, it's a tool that a church can use to connect with its members and its broader community and have a reach that, you couldn't have any other way. And again,
You're saying a church having its own podcast can do that?
definitely, but I'd push it just a little because, a lot of churches have podcasts. A lot of churches are, you're broadcasting sermons and things like that. I think the thing I'd want to emphasize to churches is don't just have a podcast, but think about how it connects to discipleship, how it connects to these big questions, worldview questions. So for us specifically, it's not just that we're creating content, quote unquote, it's that we are doing discipleship through the medium and engaging with deeper things.
Yeah, well, and I think every church, the eternal question is, how do we take the congregants who want to go deeper? How do we take them deeper, right? And the ones that are kind of there, that are they are seeking, they are young Christians. How do we bring them in? Typically that's like on a Sunday morning, but then how do we take them deeper? And it seems like the normal answer to that is, well, you go to Sunday school or you join this discipleship group, but that gets into scheduling. And even if you do one of those things, there's still, 6 other days of the week, 5 other days of the week that people are by themselves. And so it becomes this question of how do we do that? And I've been reading a book called Redeeming the Time, it's called Every Thought Captive. And that book talks a lot about redeeming your time and just being really aware of what are you putting in versus taking out. And like in the old days of radio, you were just kind of captive. If you were going to listen to the radio, you're captive to whatever's there. In the days of streaming, you can just totally curate that in your whole life. And I think it's powerful to listen to an example of like what you guys are doing, because it's teaching congregants how to think about how we interpret the Bible, right? It's not just addressing topics, but it's saying this is how we think about interpretation. But it's also just giving opportunity for, giving opportunity to build culture. And yeah, I think that's what I'm hearing you say is like we're teaching people how to think about these things, how to do it in their own life, and we're giving opportunity to engage deeper if they want.
I think, yeah, building culture is a good way to think about it, because these are all tools we're using in order to create an embodied community, right? We're not just putting content out on the ether for this disembodied idea, like a mass of listeners, quote unquote. This is an actual church, right? This is a community of people who know one another, who are in each other's lives, but are extending that through these tools. And part of that extension is, as you say, that discipleship activity is happening in their lives, even when we're not able to meet, our schedules conflict. But then the other side of it is that community grows as a result, because people enter into it through these media, but then they come and worship with you and they build those relationships. And it's like the guys I've been listening to on the podcast, I now know.
Yeah.
And that it's made you
Follow up with them on conversations that they've had.
exactly. So, have this happen often where someone had been listening to the commentary, for example, and now they've relocated to Sioux Falls and they are a member of our church, and now they are friends with the people that they've just been hearing kind of remotely, right? And to me, that's the beauty of it, is that this is a way for the body to be more present in the lives of its members, not to shift from being an embodied community to being this other thing, right? So it isn't an either or. It's not, we could do community groups, or hey, let's just go online. We're doing all of those things in order to advance that goal of discipleship, and like I say, specifically with the idea of worldview in mind, that this is about shaping, not just about even intellectual engagement, right? It's about formation,
right? So that kind of brings me to our third topic, which you had mentioned was kind of talking about vocation. And in my mind, because when we talk about worldview, sometimes that can be nebulous. Sometimes it can feel, I think, very intellectual instead of application based. And so you mentioned vocation at your church was a good way of trying to integrate those with kind of the everyday person.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. So I mentioned talking at this Christianity and Culture conference, but what crystallized this for me was speaking at a different kind of thing, which was a conference of pastors.
Okay.
So a denomination was having their kind of annual gathering of pastors and asked me to come and speak to them. And I had to sort of shift gears a little bit, right? Because I don't need to talk to these guys about how important it is to have a biblical worldview or something. But the question that a lot of them had was, like, they saw the value of it, but they're struggling to figure out how to implement that, how to do it. And so that's what I was trying to think through. Like, what advice could I give from my own experience to pastors who are looking to do this? And the light bulb came on, because I think the biggest challenge that adult believers face is that they want to pursue discipleship, right? They want to do these things, but their time commitments are such that they don't really have a lot of windows for, discipleship. So as a result, your Christian service starts to look more like maybe every year I might go on a short-term missions trip, or I might be able to volunteer in some way occasionally or something, which is great. But it has this idea that your discipleship is supplemental to everyday life, because most of your everyday life revolves around family or work. So what I realized was that if I wanted to talk to people about discipleship, I needed to be talking to them about work. That their calling, their vocation was going to be the area where most of the discipleship they engaged in happened. And I realized that the way that we were thinking about what it looks like to be a disciple of Christ at work was pretty simplistic. Most of what you were hearing was, something like, okay, so you should look for opportunities to evangelize your coworkers, right? And that's sort of how you're to be a Christian at work. And great. Dorothy Sayers, talks about how the church says to the Christian carpenter things like, don't cheat, steal. Don't
the drone.
Exactly. So basically, live a morally upright life so that you're not, conning your customers, swindling them, and making Christianity look bad, which, great, But she emphasizes that the church ought to be telling this guy to make good tables.
Yeah. The quote is, "What good is all that if at the center of his work he's a bad carpenter?"
Right. Yeah. So by focusing on doing his job well, he's glorifying God.
Yeah. I think she says he's insulting God with bad carpentry.
Sure.
I think that's the quote.
Sure. So if that's true, then you can start thinking about how you do your work in a way that glorifies God, and that's doing discipleship, right? So what we've tried to do is lean into that and really encourage people to think about how their faith would play out in their particular work. So you start with the understanding that the purpose of work is not a necessary evil, but a positive good, right? Adam and Eve before the fall have jobs, they're gardeners. So we know that work is not just a result of the fall. And so we can look at our work more positively as a way to serve other image bearers and to promote their flourishing. And once you start thinking about your work that way, these possibilities of how to do it emerge that could include all the stuff that's kind of the standard advice, but are also gonna have this sort of bigger set of implications, right? And so this one area, like if a pastor's saying, like, where do I start? Like what focus would basically like give me a leg up on discipleship in my church? I think digging into that question of vocation and trying to get people to think about their own jobs, their own work in light of their Christian worldview and Christian commitments, that will open people's eyes and they will start thinking about discipleship differently. We've done it a couple of different ways. A few years ago, we're having these sort of periodic meetings where we get together and talk about some aspect of work, have people share sort of what their particular work was like and what they saw as the challenges for a Christian doing their work and the opportunities, things like that. I think that is a great way to go about it, and I would encourage pastors. It's better if it's not all about you telling people how to think about their work. You have to have a little bit of trust and let people think it through themselves and kind of share their own insights with one another. Because, this becomes the Christian community encouraging one another to think with the mind of Christ about how they basically live their lives. And so it is what you dream of as a pastor.
Yeah.
But you needed to be the catalyst to sort of like help those conversations happen, not the only person talk.
Yeah. Okay. So, what I'm hearing basically is that facilitating conversations and bringing people in, like what came to mind whenever you said that was just that sometimes there can be a little bit of a barrier between like a pastor versus the guy who's doing shift works down at the gas plant, right? And so trying to find somebody who is in a similar job or vocation, or somebody who's just not the pastor, who is speaking from that experience of having a job like that. Even if a pastor is bivocational, it can just really be a connecting point.
Yeah. Yeah. And, it has nothing to do with the pastor himself.
Yeah.
It has more to do with the perception of his office, that you could be, down in the mines with everybody else doing the same thing. But because you have that role, you're in a different position. It's similar to the way that, parents often will talk about how, I tell my kid this every day, and then some stranger says it, and the kid's like, oh, this guy knows what he's
This guy said this amazing thing.
Exactly. And pastors have that same thing. There's certain areas where, it's surprisingly difficult to get people to actually hear what you're saying because they're taking it as it's what the pastor says. And when they're getting it from a community of people that they see as their peers, it sticks.
Yeah.
And if you ask yourself, do I want to be part of a church where the pastor is always giving me all this great wisdom and insight? Or do I want to be part of a church where everybody is sort of speaking to my questions and encouraging me, and I'm doing the same thing to them? I think we would all agree that second thing, if we had to choose, is what we want. I mean, ideally, we want them both. But the thing we long for, and the thing we often miss, is that sense that we are in an actual community where people are following Christ together. And so as a pastor or church leader, I think a lot of your work is to try to facilitate community in that way, rather than what all too often happens, organize it around yourself. As you're sort of the center of the solar system and everything depends on you and swirls around you. The reality is the best things that will happen in that church community are things that you as a pastor or leader are not responsible for. That they are what happens when you set that ball rolling.
Yeah, when you've created an environment where those who are under your teaching or in your congregation feel the freedom to take initiative, and that's when an amazing thing.
Exactly. I say this all the time to people. You don't need a pastor's permission to follow Christ. And all too often, I think we act as if, I can't do this. I need someone to lead me or whatever. And I always go back to that great G.K. Chesterton quote. We say this all the time at church, that Christianity fosters this environment where good things run wild. And so that's what you're trying to do, right? And in all of these different areas, I want that conversation about worldview, that conversation about spiritual formation to be like just running wild, having all sorts of outcomes and consequences that I never envisioned.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so as we wrap up, let's kind of talk through a couple things. So if people want to find your podcasts, where can they go?
Yeah, so the easiest thing to do would be to go to our website, which is graceforsiouxfalls.org. Sioux Falls is SIOUX Falls. But yeah, so everything, all the podcasts, all of our different courses, all of our Sunday school things we've been going through, church history, doing all sorts of things. You can find all of that stuff here. If you're interested in Worldview resources, then obviously you can go to Worldview Academy's website, worldview.org. And you should also check out Crux as well, because Crux is producing a lot of good Worldview content.
Yeah, and we're putting our stuff mostly on worldviewpublishing.com. So there's video series there and podcast in here as well.
And I think the other thing I'd want to press is there are some real world opportunities that I want pastors and other leaders to be thinking about, because yeah, listen to other podcasts, watch our videos, read our books. That's great. But you really should be thinking about getting the young people in your church to a Worldview Academy leadership camp to have that in-person experience. There is something magical about that week-long intensive camp experience. It is transformative. I've seen it in the lives of young people at my church, seen it in the lives of other young people. If you're a parent or a pastor who's wanting to get these kids not just excited about their faith, but engaged with it, that hands down is the thing I would recommend as a starting point. And then I'd go even further and I would say, if you're not actively thinking about how young people at your church could be involved at Crux, you need to be, right? So Crux is a 1-year program, a bridge year, a gap year that typically you might think of as that space between, let's say, high school and college. But to be perfectly honest, I think that undersells it by a wide margin, because I often feel in the Crux classroom like something is happening that is the thing I wish had happened in my own educational experience at college, grad school, whatever. So even though, we're situating it between high school and college, to me, it is, I don't know, it's in this other world. But again, from the outside looking in, you're thinking, oh, that's a year of your life, tuition, all that kind of thing. And I get that, but I know as a pastor, in talking to the parents in my congregation and others in our community, that what you actually care about in the long term is the spiritual well-being of those young people. All of that other stuff is noise. And so if you have those concerns, you really ought to be considering this, because it is life-changing and is a gift that you can give that student, to be in an environment where the reality of education is taken seriously. So all that just to say, yeah, go to websites, check out the resources, but seriously focus on those real world embodied experiences too.
Yeah. And I think what we both want with Worldview Academy, Worldview Publishing, Worldview Crux is just to say, like, if you want to go deeper, there's opportunity for you. And it's not just intellectual, it's application. And we're passionate about taking high school students to a place where they own their faith as a total worldview. And we want to do that with adults as well, obviously. So, these resources are used for not just high school students, but adults as well. So, all right. Well, thanks for being on today. It's a pleasure. Appreciate it.